We're going to turn now and have a look at sex ed in schools. A controversial field trip earlier this year to a sex shop threw the issue into the headlines. It also renewed the debate around what to teach students about sexual health, and that's what we're going to talk about here this hour as well. Lynn Brettel teaches at the University of Minnesota's School of Public Health, also consults with schools across the states on their sex ed programs. Lynn, thank you for being here. I'm glad you're here.
Thank you for having me.
Starri Hedges heads that Minneapolis school I referred to a moment ago that made the field trip. It's a private school near the Walker Art Center called Gaia Democratic School. Has about 30 students. And Starri, I'm glad you're here as well.
It's great to be here.
How would you rank or rate or analyze the fallout that you've had from that field trip here earlier this year?
It's been an exciting adventure, I must say. I've learned a lot through the process.
What do you mean by that?
I've learned a lot about how to talk to parents and talk to other people about sex ed. I've also learned that there's a lot of shaming around teaching sex ed out there. We got a lot of support from the community, but we also unfortunately received a lot of hate mail after we were on the Rush Limbaugh show and some other right-wing media seized the story. It was blown quite a bit out of proportion, but we're proud of our school, we're proud of our students, and we're proud to stand up for student rights to sexual health information that can save their lives and empower them.
We'll talk more about the incident and also this broader issue, too, which is what I want to talk to both of you about this hour. And I'd love to hear your questions and thoughts on what sex ed and sexual health should be taught in schools. 1-800-242-2828, 651-227-6000. You can tweet me at WeberTom1 or go online to mprnews.org. And please don't call or text if you're driving. Now, Lynn, you work with schools across the state. School year's young, but you've already been doing it, I guess, here consulting with other districts. What are the main challenges that you would say that schools have when they call you and say, help us with this?
One of the big challenges we're seeing right now for school districts, not just about sex education, but about health education in general, is that health education and time for health education is really getting pinched with all the other requirements that teachers and schools have for testing and other subjects. It seems like time for health and phy-ed, which is often where sex education is taught, that is getting squeezed so tightly. So that's a big concern, that there's just less time for sex education. The controversial nature of the topic is always a concern for our teachers and educators, knowing what they should teach, getting professional development about those topics. And so some teachers, I think, are their concerns are around what they should teach and feeling prepared to teach it, and then also feeling, is this appropriate? What's appropriate when?
I can remember many years ago when I was in high school, we were on a quarter system. So you have quarters, and so if you had physical education for 4 quarters, maybe your junior year, for example, you take one of those quarters, and that's where you learn about health, or that's where you learn about sex ed. I mean, is that still typically?
It's pretty typical that we often see, for example, schools will require health education 1 semester, 1 quarter in 9th grade, 1 semester in 11th grade. Some school districts have 1 semester of health required in 10th grade, and that's it. So it really depends on what district you're in, where you go to school. Sometimes it depends on the school building and who the teacher is. What we know for sure about sex education is that there's a lot of variation in what young people are getting.
Has the tone of it changed? Has anything changed, I guess, since when I was in high school many, many years ago, about how schools think about this or don't think about this?
A lot has changed, and I think not much has changed. Both are true at the same time. What has not changed is that, as we have seen with what Starri unfortunately experienced, is this still remains a very controversial topic. What has changed is over the last several years, the last several decades, is what we know about sex education and risk reduction programs for young people. We have a lot of evidence about what makes effective sexuality education programs and effective health education in general. We have a growing body of evidence that shows us, we can say with confidence, what we know works. So that's changed quite a bit probably since you were in school and since I was in school.
We had recently at the U, Starri, 4 surgeons general here for a conversation about sexual health. Joycelyn Elders, who was very well known in the 90s for her comments about sex ed and sexuality and masturbation, included. David Satcher was also here. And Joycelyn Elders calls it a crisis, calls sexual education or sex ed or sexual health and what we do to teach it a crisis. Do you agree with that?
I do agree with that. I also think it's a crisis that the rates of STIs and HIV and are going up here in Minnesota every year among young people. As Lynn just pointed out, we have evidence about what kinds of education works. Unfortunately, we don't seem to be practicing that in a way that is showing up statistically. Of course, at Gaia, we are not just concerned about STIs and preventing pregnancy. We're also concerned with valuing consent, stopping sexual violence, stopping sexual harassment. All these things are at crisis levels for many youth, and especially in the GLBTQIA community.
Yeah. Where does your desire to teach kids in a way you think will help them to learn, which might include a field trip, right, to a place like Smitten Kitten, where does that meet a parent's right and desire to say, no, you're not going to take my kid to that store, or no, you're not going to teach my kid that topic?
Well, first of all, I just want to point out that Gaia Democratic School is run democratically with the students. We are the only democratic school in Minnesota currently. And our big focus is actually on academic freedom. That includes controversial issues like sexual health education. But I'm not just passionate about sexual health. I just want to make that clear. Mm-hmm. I'm open to whatever our students want to learn. There is high interest in learning about sexuality, whether or not students are sexually active at this time. It is information that they want to know. So as a teacher, my responsibility is to students and to parents. But in Minnesota, minors they do have the right to learn about sexual health and to be treated for STIs or pregnancy without their parents' consent. Again, I respect parents. I myself am a parent. I want to work with parents to make sure that youth get all the information they need. Unfortunately, not all young people can talk to their parents or want to talk to their parents about some of their deep questions. And I think most parents are aware of this, that it's not always the parents that can give the most current information. There's sometimes uncomfortable issues that can come up with parents and students. So I feel very honored to be someone that young people can come to and talk about these things without having any shame around it.
What was going to be the lesson what was the lesson when you went to that shop that day?
There were several different lessons, I think, because students were allowed to meet with sexual health educators, ask specific questions, but we discussed the lesson that was given actually in the bookstore part was about safer sex, which I think we can all agree is an important issue for youth to learn about. Students did ask questions, and those were answered. So they went off in a variety of questions. We even discussed yeast infections and all sorts of health issues. Mm-hmm. So it really was not necessarily how the media made it sound.
I have a question here, Lynn, about just how the structure is and what the rules are, what the rules are not. Jen here writes in an email, would you please address why there's no statewide curriculum like in other subjects? And she may mean standards, not curriculum, mm-hmm. but we'll talk about that. My 7th grader has not had any human sexuality in school yet. I teach as much as I can, but students need better and more up-to-date mm-hmm. information. What is the current mm-hmm. Status, I guess? I'm glad she asked the question. There is no statewide standard in Minnesota for sexuality education. And real quick, Gaia is a private school. Yes. So we're talking that's a not under the auspices of the Department of Education. So just to clarify that, and what we're talking about now with you, Lynn, is state standards that public schools would then be under. This is what applies to public schools, and Jen's right. There's no statewide standard for sex education in Minnesota. There's a statute that requires school districts to have a program that addresses STI and HIV education. And there's some requirements around that, but all of those things are determined at the district level. And so what is taught, when it's taught, how much is taught, there's, like I said earlier, such a variation in how you can meet that statute. But we do not have any standards around sex education.
Health education, like I said, too, is also determined at the district level. There's some state requirements about how much is taught, but there's no statewide curriculum. The Minnesota Department of Education can help districts create those programs and meet standards of effective health education. But there's nothing statewide, not like math, science, social studies. We don't have those requirements.
What about the ability to say, no, I don't want my child learning that, to opt out? Does that exist in sex ed? And frankly, does that exist in other?
Yes, it pertains to every curriculum area.
So I could say, I don't want my kid learning geometry.
Yep. You can. You can take them out of a curriculum. You can take them out of a lesson. And this is how it works in sex education, that often, so Minnesota has an opt-out policy that when parents are often informed, not always, some districts will inform parents at the beginning of the school year what their kids are going to be taught in health education. Some do it right before the sex education unit is taught. It varies. But parents always have the right to opt their kids out. So they're not requiring active consent, which means that permission slips go home and parents have to sign them and turn them back for the students to participate. If they don't want them to participate, they opt them out. And that, like I said, can be of one lesson. It can be of the entire unit or whatever they choose for any subject matter.
Have you seen any desire or movement to change that status, whether it's to enact standards or to mandate certain amount of instruction time or something like that towards sex ed?
Well, those of us who work in the field of sex education have been advocating for quite a while to create state standards about sex education and about health education, because this will enable teachers to have a better understanding of what they can teach, what they're allowed to teach, what they're not supposed to teach. Oftentimes the confusion comes in because teachers aren't sure of what they can teach and are not clear about how the administration will or will not support them if there's any controversy surrounding it. Also, if we create state standards, we can guarantee that young people across the state are getting the same thing. It's more equitable, and it increases the amount that teachers might be offered professional development time. And in this topic is particularly important since it's a topic that teachers need to have some updated information about.
Lynn Brettel is with us from the University of Minnesota. Starri Hedges, who heads a private school called Gaia Democratic School. Were you going to add something there, Starri, to what Lynn was just saying, or no? I saw you nodding, so I just wanted to...
I think that Lynn covered it very well. I just wanted to point out that even though we are a private school, I am a big believer in the public schools, and I believe that part of the issue you're talking about is it relates to disparities. Because if private schools are the only ones that can really offer true, comprehensive, real sex ed, that leaves a lot of people at a disadvantage. And we already have a very high racial disparity in this state and across the country when it comes to sexual infections.
One thing I wanted to point out with the person who emailed in, Jen, where she said, I think her 7th grader has not had any human sexuality or development. That is unfortunately all too typical of what we see, is that young people report that what they get is too little, too late. You know, that we're teaching puberty education, for example, sometimes in 5th and 6th grade. That's too late. Young people need that information now in 3rd and 4th grade. We know that. So that's often what we hear from young people is they want more.
Would love to hear from you as well. Your thoughts on how this should be set up in schools here in Minnesota. We're talking about it in part because of this incident I was referring to with Starri and her school earlier this year, but important topic for sure. And I actually talked about this a few weeks or months ago with two former surgeons general, Joycelyn Elders and David Satcher, when they were in town. Big topic of conversation that they're focusing on as well. Would love to hear from you. 1-800-242-2828. Your questions as well. 651-227-6000. More conversation after a check of the hour's news with Stephen John. Good morning, Stephen.